Framed by soft ambient light, two silhouettes were locked in an intimate dance, casting twisting shadows as they spun. Naive to the sound of the cascading rain above, they knew little beyond the beauty they saw in each other. As the man pulled her close, his eyes rested upon hers. Like radiant emeralds, they blazed with a wild ferocity. With a confident smile, she pulled away. With a pulsating rhythm, they weaved in and out, painting a sonnet of motion that only they could hear. Smiling wide, the man relished every moment they had. As the melody began to crescendo and fall away, he pulled her in close, resting his head on her shoulder and hers on his chest. Choosing to embrace their fermata, they dared not even whisper for fear of breaking the harmony. Pressed so close together, he felt as if he understood her more than anything. The sound of her breath was a chorus with 1,000 refrains, serenading his heart with its tender tone. The way her body felt, pressed against his, was too right. If he could have held that moment in his hand, he never would have let go. Lost beneath the rhythm of the other, they were deaf to the world and how it had begun to change. The ambient light that once illuminated their steps had begun to flicker and fade, leaving incremental trails of shadow to spread across the room. As this was happening, cracks began to etch paths through the floor and up the walls. With closed eyes, they held each other tight, neglecting the world beyond their vision. Minutes grew into monoliths as their surroundings continued to fracture. The air began to buzz with an ominous intensity, and the world beyond their fingertips lost its color. Realizing that something was wrong, the girl lifted her head in concern, but the man held her close, easing her fear of the world outside of their song. Breaking their tender elegy was a strain of shattered glass. The windows had been blown inward, releasing fragmented shards into the air, cutting into the man. Screaming out, he staggered and fell to the ground. Immediately following this, the room began to degrade before their eyes. Dust blanketed the furniture, and cobwebs fashioned themselves in the corners. On his back now, the man could feel the ground vibrating with solemn malice. Roots burst through the walls as the foundation began to creak. Frantically, the man tried to return to his feet, but he found the air was getting exceedingly hard to breathe. Finally upright again, he could just barely make out the shape of the woman beyond the dust and debris that rested in the air. She was standing far away on the other side of the ballroom, screaming. Without even thinking, he started running to her side, but before he had made it even halfway, the world lurched on its side, throwing him straight through the wall. Lying in the debris, the house began to shake even more violently as the cracks made their way to the roof. "No!" the man screamed as the roof began to cave in. A sound like thunder broke the chord of chaos that had overtaken the room as a huge piece of the ceiling broke off and slammed into the ground, dividing the man and woman. From beyond the dilapidated remains of the roof, rain began to pour in, casting a strange indigo shimmer throughout the dust and debris in the air. The moist smell of raindrops and dirt permeated the room. Choking on insulation, the man dragged himself out from beneath the drywall. Too afraid for his love, he couldn't taste the blood that trickled out of his mouth. Desperately ripping through the wreckage, he made his way to the other side of the room. His heart began to sing as he saw her on her knees, untouched by the wreckage. However, his elation quickly turned to worry. She wasn't moving, and her dress was painted in crimson brush strokes. Now at her side, he could see her in grim detail. Her face was contorted in an awful sob, and all of the color had been drained from her eyes. He begged her to tell him what was wrong through teary eyes of his own, but he was met only by a strained whisper, inaudible beneath the sound of crashing rain. Too afraid to understand what was happening, he tried to help her to her feet, but he couldn't get her to move. "Come on!" he screamed. "We have to go!" But she simply stared on with a pained look in her eyes. Letting go of her hand, it limply fell to her side with a soft thud. Realization dawned on him, spreading horror to his eyes. She was paralyzed. Without a second thought, he picked her up into his arms and ran for the door. Straining from the weight of her limp body, they ran out into the rain, abandoning the building to ruin. On and on, he marched across the wind-swept land. He knew not where he was going or what he was looking for. He needed sanctuary. He needed to escape the rain. Cold and miserable beneath the storm, every step the man took was punctuated by a grimace. His lungs were burning, and his arms were dangerously close to dropping her. He couldn't go on. Falling to his knees, he softly lowered her onto the wet earth after wrapping her in his jacket. Shivering horribly, the man held her in his lap, shielding her from the rain. Just as long as he could keep her warm, he didn't care. Moments came and moments went. Her breath was growing more laborious, and her muscles were beginning to seize. Praying for the sun, he whispered in her ear, trying to comfort her, trying to comfort himself. "The rain will pass. You're going to be all right. The rain will pass. We have to be all right." As he continued to speak, he could sense the slightest hint of a smile beneath her pained grimace. Now, smiling himself, he was comforted by the sight, until a horrible wail escaped her lips, running his blood cold. He felt her hand clamp tight around his as she held her eyes shut in pain. Holding her close in a tight embrace, he could feel her heart dancing erratically in her chest. "What's wrong with you?" he thought. "Why is this happening?" As she continued to scream and convulse, he noticed something odd. He could feel what seemed like salt or thin powder running between his fingers where he held her hand. Letting go, he could see a thin stream of ash dissolve into the wind as her skin began to slowly fray and fall away. Before she could notice what was happening, her eyes grew painfully wide as she started to retch. Following this, blood began to stream in sickening rivers out of her mouth onto her chest. Spitting and gurgling, the blood bubbled in uncomfortable columns in the back of her throat, cutting off her air. Horrified, the man tried to lay her on her side, but she wrapped her arms around him with what little strength she had. Refusing to let go, he lay down in the mud with her, wiping the blood from her mouth. As close as they were, he could feel every minute movement of her crumbling body. He could feel her chest rise and fall as her hollow lungs desperately gasped for oxygen. Occasionally, her body would twist and writhe, following waves of additional pain. When this would happen, he could feel her insides shifting unnaturally, as if her organs were fighting to free themselves. As her condition rapidly declined, her flesh continued to wither away, leaving her looking pale and anemic. Between the pained lamentations of her silent weeping, her breath would catch in her throat. Far above the tragedy, the rain lessened to a drizzle, and the clouds began to part, allowing a faint glow of vermilion light to shine upon her fading beauty. Now desperately clinging to a cascade of falling ash, he watched as the light in her eyes began to fade. Every single muscle in her body was vibrating with intense vigor, fighting to combat the pain. As her touch grew cold and her skin continued to wilt, he could do little else but watch as her fading visage grew stained by the callous touch of impending decadence. "Please don't leave me," the man begged in a pained whisper. "This doesn't have to be the end." Growing even weaker now, her arms slipped out from around him, falling to her side. Reluctantly, he laid her softly on her back, afraid that his touch was only hurting her more. Now resting firmly on the ground, the girl's hair blazed beneath the morning sun as it was spread across the ground, as if it was reaching towards the horizon. Her emerald eyes lit bright as she stared right into the sun. Even now, despite her withered appearance, he couldn't help but marvel at her beauty. Kneeling beside her, praying for time to be merciful, he held his tears inside where they ate away at his soul. He refused to cry. He couldn't let her see him in pain at the very end. He refused to hurt her any more. As the sun continued to rise, a soft breeze began to flow through the valley, softly billowing beneath her clothes and snatching away flakes of her falling skin. She looked more dead than alive now. Her muscles had become flaccid, and what remained of her skin hugged her body close, as if consoling her. To hold the hand of your love and know that she'll be gone, to see her eyes fade as her beauty mocked you of its absence, forced to watch and reminisce, uncomfortably aware that those memories will be the only memories you'll ever have. To watch as your future smiles, in spite of her death, was just too hard. He couldn't hide it any longer. Right then, how could he not shed a tear? As his mourning painted rivers down his cheeks, the girl looked at him with empathy and sorrow. She gave a sad smile and lifted her hand to his face. With open palms, she let the tears fall into her hand where she held them. "No, no," she whispered. Fighting and failing to hold his tears inside, he softly placed his hand on her cheek. Her skin felt like sun-baked sand. "I love you," he wept. "Please, please don't die." Tears of her own welled up beneath her eyes. "Sorry." As the final notes of her soft refrain slowed to a stop, he could see her eyes draw blank. With one final dull beat, her arm fell away, collapsing into a cloud of ash as it struck the earth, leaving the tears she held lost in the soil. Following this was silence, and after that was a haunted elegy devoid of harmony.